Elijah Daniels woke before dawn, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, blending with the faint hum of crickets outside. He stood in the narrow bathroom of his modest home, straightening his tie in the cracked mirror. His reflection stared back at him, tired but resolute. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, worked the knot carefully, a skill he had taught himself long ago, preparing for a future he hadn't yet seen but had always hoped for. Behind him, Clara's voice carried softly from the kitchen. "Elijah, breakfast is ready." The clatter of a frying pan followed, joined by the smell of sizzling bacon wafting through the air. "Coming," he called back, tugging the tie one last time until it sat snug against his collar. Elijah stepped into the small kitchen, the worn linoleum floor cool beneath his polished shoes. Clara was at the stove, her hair neatly tied back with a floral scarf, her hands deftly flipping eggs. She turned as he entered, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "You look sharp," she said, her lips curling into a smile. "I'd better," Elijah replied, brushing a speck of lint from his shirt. First impressions matter, especially in a place like that. Ruthie and Sam, their 2 children, sat at the tiny kitchen table. Ruthie, 10 years old and already so much like her mother, smiled brightly. "Good luck, Daddy," she chirped, holding up a crayon drawing she'd been working on. It showed Elijah standing tall in a suit, holding a briefcase, surrounded by tall buildings. Elijah chuckled and bent down to kiss her forehead. "You keep this for me, Ruthie. I'll need it after today." Sam, only 6 and still half asleep, mumbled, "You'll do great, Dad," before returning his focus to the bowl of oatmeal in front of him. Clara placed a plate of eggs and toast on the table and sat down beside Elijah. As he ate, she reached across to squeeze his hand. "Remember, Elijah," she said gently, "no matter how they treat you, you've earned this. You're not just doing this for them, you're doing it for us." Elijah nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. He finished his breakfast in silence, kissed his family goodbye, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The bus ride downtown felt like a journey into another world. As Elijah watched the neighborhoods change, the houses grew larger, the streets wider, the sidewalks cleaner. By the time he stepped off the bus, the towering skyscrapers of downtown loomed above him, their glass windows reflecting the golden hues of the rising sun. He adjusted his tie once more and took a deep breath before stepping into the gleaming lobby of Winters and Lockhart. The space was cavernous and immaculate. The marble floors shone so brightly that Elijah could see his reflection in them. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals refracting the morning light into tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. Elijah hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the place pressing down on him. This was a world he had only ever seen in magazines, a world that felt distant and untouchable. But now, he was here. He tightened his grip on his lunchbox and stepped forward. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he approached the reception desk. Behind it sat a woman with a perfectly styled updo and a sharp expression. Her nameplate read Linda Carlson. She looked up as Elijah approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took him in. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped and formal. "Elijah Daniels," he said, his deep voice steady. "I'm the new janitor." Linda's lips pursed. She pressed a button on the intercom without breaking eye contact. "Mr. Daniels is here," she said curtly, then gestured toward a bench in the corner. "Wait there. Someone will fetch you." Elijah nodded and made his way to the bench, the leather creaking softly as he sat. From his seat, he watched the comings and goings of the office. Lawyers in tailored suits strode through the lobby, their movements purposeful and confident. Assistants followed behind them, clutching briefcases and stacks of papers. Elijah couldn't help but notice the way their eyes slid past him, as though he were part of the furniture. A few glanced at him briefly before looking away, their expressions unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence approached him. Robert Winters, the managing partner of the firm, carried himself with an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. His tailored suit was immaculate, and his piercing blue eyes swept over Elijah with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. "Elijah Daniels?" Robert said, his voice sharp and precise. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied, rising to his feet. Robert didn't extend his hand. Instead, he motioned for Elijah to follow him. "Come with me," he said briskly, turning on his heel. Elijah followed him through a maze of hallways, each one lined with glass-walled offices and rows of filing cabinets. The sound of Robert's polished shoes against the floor was steady and deliberate, while Elijah's more modest shoes made a softer, uneven rhythm. They stopped in a supply room at the end of the hall. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with cleaning supplies, tools, and neatly folded uniforms. Robert gestured toward the room with a sweeping motion. "This is where you'll find everything you need," he said flatly. He picked up a broom and handed it to Elijah, the motion almost theatrical, as though he were bestowing a scepter of servitude. "Keep the floors spotless. This firm thrives on appearances, and you're here to make sure we maintain ours." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," Elijah said, his voice even. Robert's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before he turned and walked away without another word. That evening, as Elijah walked home from the bus stop, the weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders. His back ached from hours of bending and scrubbing, and his hands smelled faintly of bleach, despite having washed them multiple times. When he stepped through the front door, the warmth of home greeted him like a balm. Clara was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. Ruthie and Sam sat at the table, coloring together. "How was it?" Clara asked, her voice gentle but curious. Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's different," he said carefully. "They don't want me there. Not really." Clara crossed the room and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You don't need their approval, Elijah," she said firmly. "You just need to do your best for us." Elijah nodded, her words giving him strength. Later that night, as he sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street, he thought about the day, the cold glances, the curt words, the invisible barriers he had faced. But then he thought about Ruthie's drawing, about Sam's innocent smile, about Clara's unwavering support. They were his reason to endure. The crickets sang softly in the darkness, and Elijah made a quiet vow to himself. "For them, I'll endure," he whispered, his voice steady and resolute. Elijah's days at Winters and Lockhart stretched into weeks, and those weeks dragged into months. The job, which had once seemed like a stepping stone toward a better future, quickly became a daily reminder of his place in a world that didn't want him. The initial coldness from his white colleagues had hardened into something sharper, more cutting. He wasn't just ignored anymore. He was a target. The tasks assigned to Elijah seemed designed to break him. He was constantly ordered to clean the dirtiest restrooms, the ones used by the firm's wealthiest clients, where the gold-plated fixtures gleamed mockingly under the harsh lights. The marble tiles had to be scrubbed until they shone, and if even a single smudge remained, Linda would summon him with her sharp, disdainful tone to do it all over again. "Missed a spot," she'd say, pointing with a perfectly manicured nail to a nearly invisible streak on the mirror. Her smirk always lingered a moment too long, as if daring him to react. Elijah never did. He simply nodded, picked up his cleaning supplies, and went back to work. Each indignity was a stone added to the growing weight on his shoulders, but he bore it in silence. He had no choice. The worst came one afternoon when Robert called him into the firm's grand conference room. Elijah had just finished scrubbing the floors in the reception area when Robert's voice boomed down the hallway. The sound of his name echoing off the walls made Elijah pause mid-step, his heart sinking. "Elijah! In here! Now!" When he entered, he saw Robert standing by the enormous crystal chandelier that hung over the conference table. Its countless facets sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "That chandelier is filthy," Robert said, gesturing upward with a frown. "Clean it." Elijah glanced at the rickety ladder leaning against the wall. The wood was splintered, the hinges rusted. One glance told him it wasn't safe. He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself. Robert's piercing blue eyes bore into him, leaving no room for argument. "Yes, sir," Elijah murmured. The ladder creaked ominously as he climbed. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stinging his eyes as he worked carefully, wiping each crystal with a damp cloth. One misstep, one wrong move, and he knew he could fall. But he didn't falter. He moved steadily, his grip firm despite the tremor in his hands. When he finished and climbed back down, his legs shaking from the effort, Robert barely looked at him. "Took you long enough," he muttered before walking out, leaving Elijah standing alone in the silent room. The physical strain of the job was grueling, but the emotional toll cut even deeper. Every day, Elijah endured the muttered slurs, the condescending glances, the offhand remarks that stung like barbs. Robert often referred to him as the help during meetings, a term that felt more dehumanizing each time he heard it. Even small acts of humanity were discouraged. One day, as Elijah was eating lunch in the break room, George, a young white intern, approached him. George was different from the others, polite, curious, and unafraid to speak to Elijah when no one else would. "Mr. Daniels," George said hesitantly, his voice earnest, "I just wanted to say, I've noticed how hard you work. It's inspiring." Elijah looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you, son," he replied, his voice gentle. But their moment of connection was short-lived. Linda walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She stopped abruptly when she saw them, her eyes narrowing. "George," she said, her tone cold and clipped, "don't you have work to do, or are you planning to waste the firm's time chatting in here?" George flushed and mumbled an apology before hurrying out. Linda turned her attention to Elijah, her lips curling into a sneer. "You're here to work, not to make friends," she said, her voice low and cutting. "Don't forget that." Elijah held her gaze for a moment, his jaw tightening. Then, without a word, he stood, picked up his lunchbox, and left the room. Outside the firm's walls, the world wasn't much kinder. Elijah's walk to and from work took him past the same segregated restaurants and theaters every day, their whites-only signs glaring down at him like accusations. He never stopped to linger, knowing all too well the dangers of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One evening, as he walked past a brightly lit diner, he caught a glimpse of the families inside, laughing, eating, their faces glowing in the warm light. His stomach growled, but he kept moving. Hunger was a familiar ache, one he had learned to ignore. At home, Clara saw the toll the job was taking on him. His hands were red and raw from the cleaning chemicals, his back bent from hours of scrubbing and lifting. His once bright eyes were dulled by exhaustion. "You can't keep doing this, Elijah," she said one night as they sat together on the porch. The children were asleep inside, their soft breathing a faint rhythm in the background. "It's breaking you." Elijah stared out at the quiet street, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground. "It's not time yet, Clara," he said quietly. "I just need to keep my head down." "But for how long?" she pressed, her voice trembling with worry. "You're already giving them everything. Don't let them take what's left." Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it tightly, drawing strength from her presence. One late night at the office, as Elijah mopped the empty hallways, he passed Robert's office and noticed the door slightly ajar. A faint light glowed inside, illuminating the cluttered desk. Curiosity gnawed at him. He stepped inside, his footsteps soft against the carpet. Among the scattered papers, one document caught his eye. It was a financial report, thick with numbers and jargon he didn't fully understand. But certain phrases stood out. Hidden fund, city officials, disbursements. Elijah's heart pounded as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a routine report, it was evidence of something far more sinister. Carefully, he folded the document and slipped it into his pocket. Back in the janitor's closet, Elijah sat on an overturned bucket, the document clutched tightly in his hands. He reread it under the dim light of a single bulb, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do, but he knew this much. The truth was dangerous, and now he held it in his hands. For the first time in months, Elijah felt something stir inside him. It wasn't anger or fear, it was hope. A faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, he could do more than endure. Elijah's discovery of the financial report was like a crack in the pristine facade of Winters and Lockhart. It was a small, seemingly insignificant opening, but it revealed the rot that lay beneath. From that moment on, Elijah's world changed. He no longer moved through the firm as an invisible presence, dutifully scrubbing floors and hauling supplies. Instead, he became an observer, his sharp eyes catching details he had previously ignored. In the weeks that followed, Elijah began piecing together a picture of the firm's corruption. It started with the files he was asked to shred, documents stamped with official-looking seals, invoices with suspiciously large sums, and contracts bearing names he recognized from the headlines. At first, Elijah thought he might be overthinking it, but the patterns were too consistent to dismiss. Payments to consultants who didn't seem to exist. Agreements that sidestepped legal regulations. Deals that tied the firm to powerful clients with shady reputations. Late at night, after the office was empty and the echo of his footsteps was the only sound in the corridors, Elijah would linger near the desks of the junior associates, glancing at the documents they carelessly left out. He overheard snippets of conversations in the break room and by the elevators. Whispers about favors traded with city officials, about lawsuits that had been taken care of quietly. At home, he started writing everything down in a small notebook he kept hidden in a loose floorboard under the bed. The notebook became his secret weapon, filled with dates, names, numbers, and fragments of overheard dialogue. Each entry felt like a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration that he would not remain complicit in the lies that surrounded him. Meanwhile, Robert Winters continued to treat Elijah with the same cold disdain, oblivious to the fact that the man he dismissed as the help was quietly unearthing the firm's darkest secrets. One incident, however, pushed Elijah closer to the edge. It happened during a high-profile meeting in the firm's grand conference room. Robert had invited a powerful client, a wealthy businessman named Victor Harland, known for his connections to the local police department. Victor was a burly man with a booming laugh and an arrogance that filled the room. The conversation was light and jovial at first, with Robert and Victor exchanging stories about their exploits, their words dripping with entitlement. Then, midway through the meeting, Robert reached for his coffee and knocked the mug off the table. The dark liquid spilled across the pristine white carpet, staining it instantly. Without missing a beat, Robert turned toward the door and called out, "Elijah, get in here!" Elijah, who had been mopping the hallway just outside, stepped into the room. He immediately saw the stain in the eyes of everyone in the room. Robert, Victor, and the junior associate sitting at the table, turning to him. "Clean this up," Robert said curtly, gesturing toward the spill. Elijah's throat tightened, but he nodded silently and knelt down with his cleaning supplies. As he scrubbed the carpet, Victor leaned back in his chair and let out a loud laugh. "You've got quite the staff here, Robert," Victor said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Efficient, obedient, exactly what you need." The room erupted in laughter. Elijah kept his head down, his hands trembling as he worked. His heart pounded in his chest, anger and humiliation burning in equal measure. He didn't look up, didn't let them see the fire in his eyes. But inside, something shifted. He couldn't take much more of this. When Elijah returned home that evening, Clara immediately knew something was wrong. He sat at the kitchen table staring down at his hands, which still smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning chemicals. "They humiliated you again, didn't they?" Clara said softly, sitting down across from him. Elijah didn't respond at first. His silence spoke volumes. "They see you as invisible, Elijah," Clara said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you're not. You're better than all of them. Don't let them crush you." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes tired but determined. "I'm doing this for us," he said quietly, "for Ruthie and Sam. They need me to hold on." Clara reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Holding on is one thing, but you can't just survive, Elijah. You have to fight. If not for yourself, then for them." Elijah's mind lingered on her words long after she went to bed. He stayed up late, sitting on the porch with his notebook on his lap. He flipped through the pages, rereading his notes, the names and dates jumping out at him like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. For the first time, he began to realize the power of what he held. A few days later, a surprising encounter pushed Elijah closer to a decision. He was in the break room, wiping down the counters, when George, the young intern, walked in. George hesitated at the door, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "Mr. Daniels," George whispered, his voice low, "can I talk to you?" Elijah straightened, eyeing the nervous young man. "What is it, son?" he asked. George looked around the room, as if checking to make sure they were alone. I've seen things. I know you've seen them too. The files, the conversations, the things this firm is doing, they're not right." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said cautiously. "I do," George insisted, his voice trembling. "I've been asked to shred documents that don't add up. I've overheard Mr. Winters talking about deals with city officials. I know something's wrong here, but I don't know what to do." Elijah stared at George, his heart pounding. He had always felt alone in his struggle, but now, for the first time, he saw a glimmer of an ally, someone who, despite his privileged background, recognized the corruption and wanted to help. "It's dangerous," George said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If they find out you're looking into things, they'll destroy you. But if there's something I can do to help..." Elijah held up a hand, cutting him off. "You've done enough, son," he said firmly. "You just keep your head down and stay out of trouble." George hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful, Mr. Daniels," he said before slipping out of the room. Elijah stood there for a long moment, staring at the door George had just walked through. His mind raced with possibilities. For months, he had carried the weight of the firm's corruption alone, but now he realized he wasn't the only one who saw the truth. When he got home that night, Clara noticed a change in his demeanor. He sat down at the table, his notebook in front of him, and began writing furiously. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice filled with curiosity and concern. "Taking the first step," Elijah said without looking up. His voice was steady, his resolve unshakable. "It's time." The cracks in Winters and Lockhart's polished facade began to show gradually, like the slow crumbling of a once mighty fortress. What started as murmurs in the break room and hushed whispers in the hallways soon erupted into full-blown rumors. It began with a scathing article in the local newspaper, authored by a well-respected journalist accusing the firm of illegal dealings with city officials. The article detailed under-the-table bribes, manipulated lawsuits, and corruption that traced a direct line to Robert Winters. Though the source of the tip was unnamed, the specificity of the information sent shockwaves through the office. Elijah kept his head down, working as he always had, but he could feel the mounting tension in the air. The associates, who once strode confidently through the halls, now moved with uncertainty, their laughter muted, their glances darting nervously over their shoulders. Meetings were held behind closed doors, and the junior staff spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with fear. Robert, meanwhile, was unraveling. The man who had once exuded an air of unshakable confidence now seemed like a shadow of himself. His perfectly tailored suits were still immaculate, but his movements had lost their precision. His piercing blue eyes darted nervously whenever he entered a room, scanning for signs of betrayal. During one particularly tense morning meeting, Robert slammed his hand on the conference table, his voice echoing through the room. "Who's responsible for this?" he barked, his gaze sweeping across the assembled staff. "I want names. Now." No one dared to speak. The associates avoided his eyes, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Linda, the receptionist, who had always been quick to align herself with Robert's authority, sat silently, her face pale. Elijah, who was mopping the floor just outside the conference room, paused briefly as he listened to Robert's tirade. He could hear the fear in Robert's voice, the desperation of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. Over the next few days, Robert's paranoia deepened. He began micromanaging even the smallest tasks, demanding daily reports from his staff and interrogating anyone who seemed the least bit suspicious. He lashed out frequently, his once calculated demeanor replaced by erratic outbursts. "Elijah!" Robert shouted one afternoon, summoning him to his office. When Elijah arrived, broom in hand, Robert pointed to a smudge on the window. "Clean that. Now." "Yes, sir," Elijah replied quietly, stepping forward to wipe the glass. Robert stood watching him, his gaze intense. "You've been here for years, Daniels," he said suddenly. "You see everything. You hear everything." Elijah's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. "I just do my job, sir," he said evenly, not looking up from his work. Robert stared at him for a moment longer before dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "Get out." That night, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his small notebook open in front of him. The article in the newspaper had sparked something within him, a sense that the truth might finally come to light. He had been cautious, careful not to reveal too much, but the time for caution was over. "Sarah," he said quietly as his wife joined him at the table. "I've been talking to someone." Clara's eyes widened. "Who?" "A journalist," Elijah admitted. "I've been sending him information, anonymously. He's the one who wrote the article." Clara's face was a mixture of fear and determination. "Elijah, do you know what you're risking? If Robert finds out—" "I know," Elijah interrupted, his voice firm, "but I can't keep standing by while they get away with this. The things I've seen, the things I know. It's bigger than me, Clara. It's bigger than us." Clara reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Then you do what you have to do," she said, her voice steady. "But promise me you'll be careful." Elijah nodded, the weight of her support giving him strength. The next day, Elijah sent the journalist another tip, this time including the names and dates he had meticulously documented in his notebook. He knew it was a risk, but he also knew it was the only way to expose the full extent of the firm's corruption. The investigation gained momentum quickly. Within weeks, subpoenas were issued, and the firm became the center of a legal firestorm. Robert was called to testify in court, and Elijah received a subpoena as a key witness. The decision to speak publicly was agonizing. Elijah spent sleepless nights pacing the small living room, his mind racing with fears of retaliation. What if they came after his family? What if his testimony wasn't enough? "You can do this," Clara said one evening, placing her hands on his shoulders. "You've been carrying this burden for so long, it's time to let it go." On the morning of the trial, Elijah dressed in his best suit, a modest gray ensemble that Clara had carefully ironed the night before. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, Ruthie and Sam appeared in the doorway. "You look like a hero, Daddy," Ruthie said, her eyes shining with admiration. Elijah knelt down and hugged his children tightly. "I'm doing this for you," he whispered. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised, while the legal teams from both sides filled the benches. Robert sat at the defense table. his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. He barely acknowledged Elijah as he entered. When it was time for Elijah to take the stand, the room fell silent. He walked slowly to the witness box, his heart pounding, and took a seat. The prosecutor approached, a young woman with sharp eyes and a confident demeanor. "Mr. Daniels," she began, "can you tell us about your time at Winters and Lockhart?" Elijah nodded, his voice steady as he began to speak. He recounted the years of abuse, the demeaning tasks, and the racial slurs. He described the files he had been ordered to shred, the conversations he had overheard, and the patterns of corruption he had uncovered. As he spoke, the courtroom hung on his every word. The details were damning, leaving no room for doubt. Robert's attorney tried to discredit him, painting him as a disgruntled employee, but Elijah remained composed. He answered every question calmly, his unwavering truth cutting through the defense's arguments like a knife. When he finished, there was a palpable tension in the room. Robert sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched, while the prosecutor delivered her closing remarks. "Mr. Daniels," she said, turning back to him, "is there anything else you'd like to say?" Elijah looked across the courtroom, his gaze meeting Robert's for the first time. "Yes," he said quietly, "the truth matters. No matter how much power you have, no matter how much money you make, you can't hide from it forever." Elijah's testimony leads to a historic and unprecedented settlement that sends shockwaves through the legal world. The firm, once a powerhouse of influence and prestige, begins to unravel under the weight of the scandal, its foundation crumbling as the truth comes to light. The revelation exposes a series of unethical practices and corruption that shake the very core of the industry. As the firm collapses, Robert, the once untouchable figure at the helm, is stripped of his power, influence, and reputation. His world, which he had carefully constructed over decades, shatters in a matter of days. In the aftermath, the media hails Elijah as a hero, celebrating his courage and integrity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Reporters swarm him with questions, eager to know the man behind the testimony that changed everything. "How does it feel to be the one who brought down a giant?" one asks, microphone thrust in his direction. Elijah, ever humble, smiles gently and replies, "It's not about bringing anyone down. It's about making sure the truth rises to the surface." His calm, measured words carry a weight that resonates deeply with the public. He quickly shifts the focus away from himself, redirecting it to the cause he fought for, the people whose voices had been silenced. "I did this for them," he adds softly. Despite the accolades and praise, Elijah remains focused on what truly matters: his family and his community. He returns to his quiet life, stepping away from the limelight and spending his days with his children, his wife, and the neighbors who have supported him throughout the ordeal. One evening, as he sits on the porch, his daughter hops into his lap and asks, "Daddy, are you a superhero?" He chuckles, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a man who tries to do the right thing." In a powerful and emotional final scene, Robert, now a broken and disgraced man, approaches Elijah outside the courthouse. His once immaculate suit is rumpled, his posture slouched, and the swagger that once accompanied his every step is now gone, replaced by a defeated shuffle. The weight of his downfall is visible in his weary eyes. He stands before Elijah, his voice trembling, almost unrecognizable from the confident baritone it once was. "I didn't see you for who you were, Elijah," Robert admits, a bitter sadness in his tone. "I thought I could control everything. But now look, I've lost everything. The firm, my career, my reputation, it's all gone. And for what? A lie." Elijah, his hands in his pockets, meets Robert's gaze with an unflinching calm. The years of bitterness and animosity between them hang in the air, yet Elijah remains grounded. He doesn't flinch or back down. Instead, his voice is steady, his words deliberate. "You never saw me, Mr. Winters," he says softly, but with unmistakable authority. "You saw what you wanted to see, a pawn in your game, but I wasn't that." He pauses, letting the truth settle. "And now the world sees who I really am." Robert's shoulders sag further under the weight of Elijah's words, and he looks away, his face flushed with shame. "I always thought I was the one with the power. You were just a man, but you're more than I ever gave you credit for." Elijah doesn't respond immediately, his gaze steady on Robert, before finally saying, "Power doesn't come from titles or wealth, Mr. Winters. It comes from standing up for what's right, even when the world tells you to stay silent." Robert looks back at Elijah, his voice barely a whisper. "And what happens now? What do I do now?" Elijah's gaze hardens slightly. "You rebuild, but this time you rebuild with honesty, with humility, because the only way forward is through truth." The silence between them stretches for a long moment before Robert turns, his steps slow and uncertain. As he walks away, Elijah watches him go, the finality of the situation clear. Elijah has given him a glimpse of redemption, but it's a path Robert will have to walk alone. Elijah uses the settlement money not for personal gain, but to create a lasting impact in the community that supported him throughout his journey. With careful thought and dedication, he establishes a community center designed to provide both education and legal aid to marginalized families. The center is built in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood that has long struggled with poverty and systemic inequality. The community center becomes a beacon of hope, offering a safe space for those who have been overlooked and underserved. The walls are filled with educational resources, books, computers, and classrooms where local children can receive tutoring and mentorship. In one corner, volunteers offer legal counsel to families facing housing disputes, immigration issues, and other legal challenges. Elijah personally oversees the operation, ensuring that the focus remains on providing tangible, practical support to those who need it most. The community center quickly becomes a hub of activity, a place where families can find not only the resources they need, but also the strength to confront the obstacles standing in their way. Workshops on financial literacy, healthcare access, and legal rights are offered regularly, empowering individuals to take control of their futures. Elijah invites former colleagues, local leaders, and community advocates to speak and share their expertise, fostering a network of support that spans beyond the center's walls. As the center flourishes, Elijah's story spreads, inspiring others to take action in their own communities. People who have faced similar injustices see Elijah's transformation from a victim of corruption to a leader of change, and they are moved to make a difference in their own lives. His journey shows them that even in the face of immense suffering, resilience and courage can lead to something greater. Elijah's message is clear. Standing up against injustice doesn't always mean fighting on the front lines in a courtroom. It can also mean creating lasting change that empowers others to do the same. Local newspapers, social media, and word of mouth amplify the story of the community center, showcasing Elijah's tireless work and the positive impact it has had. Families who once felt powerless begin to realize they are not alone. "Elijah gave me hope when I thought I had none," one single mother says, her voice breaking as she shares her experience. "He showed me that I could fight for my rights, and now I have a place to turn to when I need help." The center also serves as a reminder that change, while slow, is possible. It stands as a living testament to Elijah's belief that even in a world filled with corruption and inequality, individuals can make a meaningful difference. Elijah frequently reflects on his journey, humbled by the people whose lives he's touched. He sees each success story as a victory, not just for those who have benefited directly from the center, but for the movement toward a more just and compassionate society. With every person who walks through the doors of the community center, Elijah is reminded of the power of resilience, the strength to rebuild and move forward after the darkest of times. His own story continues to serve as an inspiration, a symbol of how one person, armed with courage and a belief in justice, can alter the course of an entire community. Elijah's legacy is not just one of legal victories, but of lives transformed, proving that even in the harshest moments, hope and determination can pave the way to a brighter future.